The roar of helicopter rotors cut through the humid morning air as Captain Sarah Mitchell executed what her commanding officers would later describe as another one of her dangerous stunts. Banking sharply to the left, she threaded her UH-60 Black Hawk between two towering radio antennas with barely 10 feet of clearance on either side. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Chen, gripped his harness so tightly his knuckles went white. "Jesus, Mitchell, are you trying to kill us?" Chen shouted over the engine noise. Sarah's voice crackled through the intercom, steady and confident despite the death-defying maneuver they'd just completed. "Relax, Chen. I had at least 8 feet of clearance. That's practically a highway." This was Captain Sarah Mitchell, a pilot whose reputation preceded her wherever she went. At 28 years old, she had already logged over 1,200 flight hours in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. Her record was spotless when it came to mission success rates, but her methods were anything but conventional. While other pilots played it safe, following standard operating procedures to the letter, Sarah pushed boundaries that made her superiors nervous and her fellow aviators either deeply impressed or genuinely terrified. Before we jump back in, tell US where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Born in rural Montana to a family of crop dusters, Sarah had been around aircraft since she could walk. Her father, Jack Mitchell, owned a small agricultural aviation business, and Sarah spent her childhood summers riding along on pesticide runs. Watching her father navigate between power lines, trees, and irrigation systems with the precision of a surgeon. By age 16, she was already handling the controls, and by 18, she had earned her private pilot's license. The transition from civilian to military aviation hadn't been smooth. The structured environment of flight school clashed with Sarah's instinctive, free-form approach to flying. Her instructors constantly battled between admiration for her natural talent and frustration with her tendency to improvise. She graduated near the top of her class, but not without collecting a thick file of disciplinary actions along the way. Mitchell flies like she's dancing with the aircraft. Her primary instructor, Colonel James Harrison, had written in her evaluation, "She has an intuitive understanding of aerodynamics that I've rarely seen." However, her willingness to deviate from established procedures makes her a liability in structured operations. Despite these concerns, Sarah's undeniable skill earned her assignment to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, better known as the Night Stalkers. This elite unit specialized in high-risk, low-visibility missions that required pilots capable of operating in the most challenging conditions imaginable. It seemed like the perfect fit for someone with Sarah's unconventional talents, but even among the Night Stalkers, Sarah stood out for all the wrong reasons. Her fellow pilots respected her abilities but questioned her judgment. During training exercises, she would take risks that made seasoned veterans nervous. She would fly lower than regulations allowed, navigate through weather that grounded other aircraft, and execute maneuvers that pushed both machine and pilot to their absolute limits. She's either going to be the best pilot we've ever had, or she's going to get herself and everyone around her killed. Captain Rodriguez had confided to his squadron leader after watching Sarah perform a particularly aggressive insertion during a training exercise. The breaking point came during a routine supply run to a forward operating base in Afghanistan. The mission was straightforward: transport medical supplies and personnel to a remote outpost in the mountains. The weather was marginal, with low clouds and occasional rain showers, but well within acceptable parameters for experienced pilots. Sarah's approach to the landing zone was textbook perfect until the final 30 seconds. Instead of following the standard glide path, she suddenly dropped altitude and came in from an unexpected angle, weaving between two peaks that weren't on the approved approach route. The maneuver was executed flawlessly, but it violated multiple regulations and put the aircraft dangerously close to controlled flight into terrain. Major William Thompson, the base operations officer, was waiting for her when she shut down the engines. His face was grim as he approached the aircraft. "Mitchell, what the hell was that approach? You came in from the northwest sector. That's a no-fly zone due to enemy activity." Sarah removed her helmet, her short auburn hair damp with sweat. "Sir, I observed enemy movement along the standard approach route. Small arms fire was directed at the aircraft ahead of us. I made a tactical decision to use an alternate route that would minimize exposure to hostile fire. That alternate route took you through a valley that's been designated as extremely high risk. You put your crew and passengers in unnecessary danger. With respect, sir, I put them in less danger than they would have faced following the standard approach. The mission was completed successfully with no casualties." But Major Thompson wasn't buying it. He'd seen Sarah's file, knew about her pattern of bending rules and pushing limits. This incident was the final straw. "Mitchell, you're grounded pending a full investigation. Your disregard for standard operating procedures and your tendency to take unnecessary risks make you unsuitable for combat operations." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Flying wasn't just her job, it was her identity, her purpose, her life. Being grounded was worse than any punishment they could have devised. She stood at attention, her jaw clenched, as Major Thompson continued his verbal assault. "You seem to think that being a good pilot means taking risks that other pilots won't take. But in military aviation, the best pilots are the ones who bring everyone home safely while following established procedures. Your recklessness is going to get people killed." As Sarah walked away from that confrontation, she couldn't have known that within 48 hours, her so-called recklessness would be the only thing standing between 8 Marines and certain death. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving Sarah 3 days to contemplate her uncertain future. She spent most of that time in her quarters, poring over flight manuals and regulations, trying to understand how her superiors could view her adaptive flying style as dangerous, when it had never resulted in an accident or mission failure. Her roommate, Captain Lisa Park, found her hunched over a stack of technical documents at 0200 hours, surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled papers. "You know, staring at those pages isn't going to change what happened," Lisa said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "I'm trying to understand their perspective," Sarah replied without looking up. "According to regulations, what I did was wrong. But according to the tactical situation, it was the right call. How do I reconcile that?" Lisa had flown with Sarah on several occasions and had witnessed firsthand both her exceptional skill and her tendency to color outside the lines. Maybe the point isn't to reconcile it. Maybe the point is to find a way to use your abilities within the system. "The system is designed for average pilots flying in average conditions," Sarah said, finally looking up. "But war isn't average. Combat isn't average. The enemy doesn't care about our standard operating procedures. Neither do court-martial boards," Lisa replied gently. "Sarah, you're the best pilot I've ever seen. But if you can't find a way to work within the military structure, you're going to be flying cargo planes for the rest of your career, if you're lucky." Meanwhile, 200 miles to the southeast, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres was leading his 8-man reconnaissance team through the rugged terrain of the Hindu Kush Mountains. Their mission was to establish an observation post overlooking a valley that intelligence reports indicated was being used as a major supply route by enemy forces. Torres was a veteran of 3 combat deployments, and his team consisted of some of the most experienced Marines in the regiment. Corporal James Wright, the team's communications specialist, had been in country for 14 months. Private First Class Danny Sullivan, their designated marksman, had already earned 2 Bronze Stars for valor. Lance Corporal Roberto Vasquez, the team medic, had saved more lives than anyone could count. The team moved with practiced efficiency through the pre-dawn darkness, their night vision equipment turning the alien landscape into a green-tinted maze of rocks and shadows. They had been inserted by helicopter 12 hours earlier and had been moving steadily toward their objective ever since. "Control, this is Recon 7. Torres whispered into his radio as they approached the designated observation point. "We're approximately 1 click from the objective. Terrain is more challenging than anticipated, but we're making good progress." The voice of their operations officer crackled back through the encrypted radio. "Copy, Recon 7. Weather reports indicate a storm system moving into your area. You have approximately 6 hours before conditions become unfavorable for extraction." Torres acknowledged the transmission and signaled his team to continue moving. The observation post was situated on a narrow ridge that provided an excellent view of the valley below, but offered limited options for cover or concealment. It was exactly the kind of position that military planners loved on paper, but that infantry soldiers knew could become a death trap under the palm of the wrong circumstances. As the team settled into their positions and began setting up their equipment, Torres couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The valley below was too quiet, too empty. In his experience, major supply routes were rarely completely deserted, even during daylight hours when movement was more dangerous. "Vasquez, what's your read on this?" Torres asked his most experienced team member. Lance Corporal Vasquez lowered his binoculars and frowned. "Feels like a setup, Sergeant. This valley's supposed to be crawling with enemy activity, but I haven't seen so much as a goat since we got here." "Maybe they changed routes," suggested Corporal Wright. "Intelligence isn't always accurate." But Torres wasn't convinced. He'd learned to trust his instincts over intelligence reports, and every instinct he had was screaming that they were walking into a trap. Unfortunately, his instincts were absolutely correct. 3 miles away, a group of enemy fighters had been monitoring the Marines' approach using thermal imaging equipment. They had no intention of confronting the reconnaissance team directly. Instead, they planned to wait until the Marines were isolated and committed to their position, then cut off their escape routes and call in reinforcements. The enemy commander, a battle-hardened veteran who had been fighting foreign forces for over a decade, smiled as he watched the Marines settle into their observation post. He had used this tactic successfully many times before. Foreign soldiers were predictable. They followed their procedures, stuck to their timelines, and relied too heavily on their technology. It made them easy to trap. "Let them get comfortable," he told his second-in-command. "Once they begin their surveillance, we'll seal off the valley and make our move." Back at the airbase, Sarah was trying to distract herself from her pending disciplinary hearing by reviewing weather reports and flight schedules. The storm system that was moving toward the reconnaissance team's position was also affecting flight operations at the base. Several missions had already been canceled or delayed due to deteriorating conditions. She noticed that the extraction mission for Recon 7 was still scheduled for 1800 hours, despite forecasts showing severe weather moving into the area. The assigned pilot was Captain Rodriguez, a competent aviator, but one who was known for his strict adherence to safety protocols. Sarah made a note in her personal log: "Weather conditions marginal for extraction operations. Recommend moving timeline earlier or preparing alternate extraction plans." It was the kind of tactical thinking that made her an exceptional pilot, but it was also the kind of second-guessing that had gotten her into trouble with her superiors. She was grounded after all, and had no business concerning herself with active mission planning. But old habits die hard, and Sarah Mitchell had never been the type of person to sit on the sidelines when lives were at stake. The first sign of trouble came at 0847 hours when Corporal Wright's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. Instead of the routine check-in from their operations center, they received a burst of static followed by voices speaking in a language none of them recognized. "That's not good," Wright muttered, adjusting his radio's frequency settings. "Somebody's jamming our primary communication channel." Staff Sergeant Torres crawled over to Wright's position, keeping his head below the ridgeline. "Can you work around it?" "I'm trying, but they're hitting us across multiple frequencies. This isn't some amateur hour operation. They've got professional grade." Jamming equipment. Torres felt his stomach drop. Radio jamming meant that someone knew exactly where they were and was deliberately trying to isolate them. It was a classic prelude to an ambush. "Pack it up," he ordered. "We're moving to the alternate extraction point." But as his team began breaking down their equipment, Private First Class Sullivan, who had been monitoring the valley through his rifle scope, hissed a warning. "Sergeant, we've got movement. Multiple contacts, approximately 800 meters. South." Torres grabbed his binoculars and focused on the area Sullivan had indicated. What he saw made his blood run cold. A group of enemy fighters was moving in a coordinated pattern, clearly attempting to surround their position. These weren't opportunistic insurgents. They were organized, well-equipped, and obviously knew exactly where the Marines were located. "Contact." "Front!" Torres shouted as the first muzzle flashes appeared in the valley below. "Defensive positions, now!" The ridge erupted in chaos as enemy rounds began impacting around the Marines' position. Torres's team was well-trained and experienced, but they were outnumbered and caught in an extremely vulnerable position. The narrow ridge offered little cover, and the enemy fighters were approaching from multiple directions. Lance Corporal Vasquez, the team medic, was treating a wounded Marine when a burst of automatic weapon fire stitched across the rocks near his position. Stone fragments peppered his face, but he continued working on his patient. "We need to move," he shouted over the gunfire. "This position is indefensible." But Torres could see that they were already surrounded. Enemy fighters had moved to block both ends of the ridge, and the steep slopes on either side offered no escape. "Route, they were trapped. Control, this is Recon 7. Torres shouted into his radio, hoping that someone would hear them despite the jamming. "We are under heavy fire and need immediate extraction. 8 personnel, wounded, enemy contact on multiple sides." The response was barely audible through the static. "Recon 7, we copy your transmission. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Extraction aircraft are grounded due to severe weather." Torres couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Control, we are combat ineffective and surrounded. We need extraction now. Recon 7, all aircraft are grounded. Weather conditions are below minimums for flight operations. You need to hold your position until conditions improve." The irony wasn't lost on Torres. They were trapped on a ridge, with no way out, surrounded by enemy fighters, and their only hope of survival was weather conditions that were too dangerous for their own pilots to fly in. Back at the airbase, the operations center was in chaos. Weather reports showed winds gusting up to 45 knots, visibility dropping to less than a quarter mile, and severe turbulence throughout the area. It was exactly the kind of weather that grounded even the most experienced military pilots. Captain Rodriguez, who was scheduled to fly the extraction mission, stood before the weatherboard, shaking his head. "There's no way we can launch in this. It would be suicide." Major Thompson, the same officer who had grounded Sarah Mitchell 2 days earlier, was facing an impossible decision. 8 Marines were trapped and under fire, but sending rescue helicopters into the storm would likely result in additional casualties. "What about pushing the mission back until the weather clears?" suggested the operations officer. "The forecast shows this storm system lasting another 6 hours, Rodriguez replied. "Those Marines don't have 6 hours. In the communications center, Sarah Mitchell was monitoring the radio traffic despite being officially grounded. She had heard the distress calls from Recon 7 and had been tracking the weather system on her personal tablet. What she saw made her realize that conventional extraction operations were impossible, but that didn't mean extraction was impossible. Sarah had grown up flying crop dusters in weather that would terrify most pilots. She had learned to read wind patterns, navigate by feel when visibility dropped to zero, and land aircraft in conditions that existed somewhere between challenging and impossible. The storm that was grounding every other pilot on the base was dangerous, but it wasn't insurmountable. She made a decision that would either save 8 lives or end her military career permanently. Walking quickly to the hangar where her Black Hawk was parked, Sarah began her pre-flight inspection. The aircraft was technically grounded along with its pilot, but the maintenance crews hadn't removed it from service. As far as the paperwork was concerned, it was still mission ready. "Mitchell, what are you doing?" The voice belonged to Chief Warrant Officer Thompson, the senior maintenance supervisor. "Pre-flight inspection," Sarah replied without looking up from the engine compartment. "You're grounded. This bird isn't going anywhere." Sarah finally looked up, her green eyes blazing with determination. 8 Marines are going to die if someone doesn't get them out of there. The weather's too bad for a standard extraction, but I can do it. Mitchell, you'll be court-martialed. Your career will be over. My career's already over, Sarah replied. But those Marines' lives don't have to be. The stage was set for either the most heroic rescue mission in military aviation history or the most spectacular career-ending disaster anyone had ever witnessed. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson watched in disbelief as Sarah continued her pre-flight inspection with mechanical precision. Her movements were deliberate and focused, the actions of a pilot who had made peace with the consequences of her decision. "Mitchell, listen to me. Even if you could somehow get that bird off the ground in this weather, you'll never find those Marines in zero visibility. It's a suicide mission." Sarah paused in her inspection of the main rotor assembly and looked directly at Thompson. "Chief, I've been flying in weather like this since I was 16 years old. My father used to say that storms don't cancel the harvest, they just make it more challenging. This isn't crop dusting, Mitchell. This is a combat zone with enemy fighters, mountain terrain, and weather that's grounded every other pilot on this base. Which is exactly why I'm the only one who can do this," Sarah replied, continuing her inspection. "Every other pilot here learned to fly in controlled conditions with perfect weather and full visibility. I learned to fly in Nebraska thunderstorms and Montana blizzards. This is what I was trained for." Thompson realized that reasoning with Sarah was futile. She had already made her decision, and nothing he could say would change her mind. "At least, let me assign you a co-pilot. Chen is experienced and no." Sarah's voice was firm. "I'm not risking anyone else's career or life. This is my decision, and I'll face the consequences alone." What Thompson didn't know was that Lieutenant Chen had been listening to the conversation from the adjacent hangar. The young co-pilot had flown with Sarah on numerous occasions and had witnessed both her exceptional skill and her tendency to push boundaries. Despite his earlier nervousness about her flying style, he had developed a deep respect for her abilities. "Actually, Chief, I think you're wrong about that," Chen said as he emerged from the shadows. "Regulations clearly state that Black Hawks require a 2-person crew for combat operations. If Captain Mitchell is determined to fly this mission, she need a co-pilot." Sarah turned to face Chen, surprise evident in her expression. "Marcus, you don't understand what you're volunteering for. This isn't a sanctioned mission. We're both looking at court-martial proceedings if we proceed." Chen began putting on his flight gear with the same methodical precision Sarah had demonstrated. "Captain, I've flown with you enough to know that you're not reckless, you're adaptive. There's a difference between taking unnecessary risks and taking calculated risks in extraordinary circumstances. The weather conditions are beyond anything we've encountered together," Sarah warned. "Visibility is essentially zero, winds are gusting over 40 knots, and we'll be flying into a combat zone where friendly forces are under active fire. Which is exactly why those Marines need pilots who are willing to operate outside normal parameters," Chen replied. Standard procedures won't work in this situation. We need to do what we do best, adapt and improvise. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Sarah and Chen completed their pre-flight preparations, word of their unauthorized mission began spreading through the base. Some personnel viewed their actions as heroic, while others saw them as dangerously insubordinate. Major Thompson, who had grounded Sarah just 2 days earlier, was called to the hangar as the Black Hawk's engines began spooling up. Mitchell, shut down those engines immediately. Thompson shouted over the increasing rotor noise. Sarah's voice came through the aircraft's external speakers. Sir, with respect, 8 Marines are going to die if we don't extract them in the next hour. The weather conditions are challenging, but not impossible for pilots with the right experience and training. You're disobeying a direct order. This is grounds for immediate court-martial. Yes, sir, it is, Sarah replied calmly. But I'd rather face a court-martial than explain to 8 families why their sons didn't come home when I could have saved them. Thompson realized that he was facing an impossible situation. If he physically prevented Sarah from taking off, the Marines would almost certainly die. If he allowed her to proceed, he would be tacitly approving an unauthorized mission that violated numerous regulations and safety protocols. Mitchell, if you proceed with this mission, you'll be doing so without official authorization or support. If something goes wrong, we can't help you. Understood, sir. We'll bring them home. As the Black Hawk lifted off into the storm, base personnel watched in a mixture of admiration and terror. The aircraft disappeared into the low-hanging clouds within seconds, leaving only the fading sound of rotor blades and the knowledge that 8 lives now depended on the skills of a pilot who had been grounded for being too reckless. Meanwhile, on the ridge, Staff Sergeant Torres and his team were fighting for their lives. The enemy fighters had tightened their encirclement, and ammunition was running critically low. Lance Corporal Vasquez was treating 2 wounded Marines while trying to return fire, and their defensive perimeter was shrinking by the minute. Control. This is Recon 7, Torres shouted into his radio. We have multiple wounded and are running low on ammunition. We need immediate extraction or resupply. The response was barely audible through the static and jamming. Recon 7, extraction aircraft are en route. Maintain your position and prepare for immediate extraction. Torres couldn't believe what he was hearing. No sane pilot would attempt to fly in the current weather conditions, but he had learned not to question miracles during his multiple combat deployments. You heard them, he shouted to his team. Extraction inbound. Prepare for immediate extraction. But as the Marines began organizing their wounded and preparing for evacuation, the enemy fighters launched their final assault. Knowing that helicopter extraction was imminent, they concentrated their fire on the landing zone. Determined to prevent the Marines from escaping, the ridge erupted in the most intense firefight Torres had ever experienced. Enemy rounds were impacting constantly around their position, and he could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different directions. His team was vastly outnumbered and almost out of ammunition. Vasquez, how are our wounded? Torres called out during a brief lull in the firing. Sullivan's got a through and through in his shoulder, and Martinez took shrapnel to the leg. Both are ambulatory, but they need medical attention soon. Torres did a quick ammunition count and realized they had perhaps 5 minutes of effective fire remaining. After that, they would be defenseless against the enemy assault. Whatever aircraft is coming for us better get here fast, he muttered, chambering his last magazine. The storm hit the Black Hawk like a physical blow as soon as it cleared the base perimeter. Sarah felt the aircraft shudder and buck as wind. Gusts reached nearly 50 knots, but she adjusted her grip on the controls and continued climbing toward the Marine's position. Jesus, Mitchell, I can't see anything, Chen shouted over the intercom. The windscreen was a wall of gray, and their instruments were the only indication of their aircraft's attitude and position. "Don't rely on your eyes," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the violent turbulence. "Trust the instruments and feel the aircraft. The helicopter will tell you what it needs if you know how to listen." Chen had flown with Sarah before, but never in conditions like this. The aircraft was being tossed around like a toy, and every instinct he had was screaming that they should turn around and return to base. But as he watched Sarah's calm, methodical approach to flying in impossible conditions, he began to understand why she had developed such a reputation for unconventional flying. "How are you staying so calm?" he asked as another violent gust nearly rolled the aircraft inverted. "Because I've flown in worse weather than this," Sarah replied, making minute adjustments to their heading. "When I was 17, I got caught in a tornado while crop dusting in Kansas. That taught me that aircraft can handle a lot more stress than most pilots think, if you know how to work with the weather instead of fighting against it." The navigation equipment was being affected by the storm, making it difficult to determine their exact position. Sarah was relying on a combination of GPS coordinates, terrain features, and her intuitive understanding of the landscape to guide them toward the Marine's position. "We're about 10 minutes out from the LZ," she announced. "Start monitoring the emergency frequencies. Those Marines are going to need to guide us in, because we won't be able to see them until we're almost on top of them." As if summoned by her words, Torres's voice crackled through the radio. "Extraction aircraft. This is Recon 7. We are taking heavy fire and need immediate extraction. Can you provide your estimated time of arrival?" Sarah keyed her microphone. "Recon 7, this is Rescue 1. We're approximately 8 minutes from your position. Be advised, weather conditions are severe and visibility is near zero. We'll need you to guide us in using sound and any available light sources." "Roger." "Rescue 1, we'll pop smoke when we hear your approach. Be advised, the LZ is under direct fire from multiple positions. This is going to be a hot extraction." Chen looked at Sarah with growing concern. "A hot extraction in zero visibility? How are we supposed to land in a firefight when we can't see?" "The ground? Very carefully," Sarah replied, "and very quickly." As they approached the Marine's position, the storm seemed to intensify. Lightning flickered through the clouds, briefly illuminating the rugged terrain below, and the wind was gusting so violently that Sarah had to constantly adjust the controls to maintain level flight. "I can hear them," Chen said, pointing toward a faint crackling sound coming through the radio. "That's gunfire." Sarah was already beginning her approach, guided by the GPS coordinates and the increasingly loud sound of the firefight below. She had reduced their airspeed to just above stall speed, using every ounce of her skill to maintain control in the turbulent conditions. "Recon 7, we're starting our approach. Pop smoke now." Torres's voice came back immediately. "Smoke out." "Green smoke, green smoke." Through the swirling gray clouds, Sarah caught a glimpse of green smoke being dispersed by the wind. It was barely visible, but it gave her a reference point for the Marine's position. "I've got the smoke," she told Chen. "Prepare for a combat." Landing. What happened next would be talked about in military aviation circles for years to come. Sarah brought the Black Hawk down through the storm with a precision that bordered on supernatural. She couldn't see the ground, couldn't see the obstacles, and was navigating purely by instinct and the faint visual cues provided by the Marines. Smoke grenades. The aircraft touched down with surprising gentleness, considering the impossible conditions. But as soon as they were on the ground, enemy fire began impacting around their position. "Go, go, go!" Sarah shouted over the intercom. "Get those Marines loaded now." Chen jumped out of the aircraft and began helping the wounded Marines toward the cargo door. Enemy rounds were hitting the ground around them, and he could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions in the surrounding terrain. Staff Sergeant Torres appeared at Sarah's window, his face blackened with cordite and his eyes wide with disbelief. "Ma'am, I don't know how you got here, but we've got 2 wounded and need to get out of here immediately." "Load them up, Sergeant. We're not leaving anyone behind." As the Marines scrambled aboard the aircraft, Sarah kept the engines running and the rotors turning. She could feel enemy rounds impacting the aircraft's fuselage, and she knew that every second they remained on the ground increased the risk of catastrophic damage. "We're loaded," Chen shouted as he climbed back into the co-pilot's seat. 8 Marines, 2 wounded. "Here we go," Sarah said, pulling collective and beginning their ascent back into the storm. But as they lifted off, she realized that their troubles were just beginning. The aircraft was now much heavier with 8 additional passengers. The weather conditions were worsening, and she could hear the ominous sound of damage to the aircraft systems. "Mitchell, we've got a problem," Chen said, studying his instrument panel. "Hydraulic pressure is dropping, and I'm seeing indications of damage to the tail rotor system." Sarah's heart sank. A damaged tail rotor in these weather conditions could be fatal, but she had 8 Marines counting on her to get them home safely, and she wasn't about to let them down. "How bad is it?" she asked, fighting to maintain control as the aircraft climbed through the turbulent air. "Bad enough that we need to get on the ground as soon as possible," Chen replied. "This bird isn't going to make it back to base." The Black Hawk shuddered violently as Sarah fought to maintain control with a damaged tail rotor system. The aircraft was yawing unpredictably, and she had to use constant pedal inputs to keep them flying straight. With 8 Marines in the cargo bay and weather conditions that would challenge even a fully functional aircraft, they were facing a nearly impossible situation. "Rescue 1, this is Control. We're tracking your position. What's your status?" The voice from base operations crackled through the radio. Sarah keyed her microphone while simultaneously fighting the controls. "Control, we have successful extraction of 8 personnel, but we've sustained damage to the tail rotor system. Hydraulic pressure is dropping, and we're losing authority. Rescue 1, can you make it back to base?" Sarah looked at her instruments and felt her heart sink. The hydraulic system was failing faster than she had hoped, and the tail rotor damage was getting worse. "Negative control. We need to find an alternate landing site immediately." In the cargo bay, Staff Sergeant Torres was doing his best to keep his Marines calm, despite the obvious problems with the aircraft. The 2 wounded Marines were being treated by Lance Corporal Vasquez, but everyone could feel the aircraft's increasingly erratic flight characteristics. "What's our situation, Sergeant?" asked Private First Class Sullivan, who was fighting to stay conscious despite his shoulder wound. "We're flying home in a damaged bird through the worst weather I've ever seen. Being piloted by someone who was grounded for being too reckless," Torres replied. "So basically, it's a normal Tuesday in the Marine Corps." Despite the gravity of their situation, several Marines chuckled at Torres's dark humor. It was exactly the kind of leadership that had kept them alive during the firefight, and it was helping to keep them focused now. Meanwhile, Sarah was scanning the terrain below through brief breaks in the clouds, looking for any possible landing site. The mountainous terrain offered few options, and most of the valleys were too narrow or too rocky for a safe landing. She needed to find a relatively flat area, large enough for the Black Hawk, but time was running out. "There," Chen pointed toward a break in the clouds. "That valley looks like it might have a flat area near the river." Sarah banked the aircraft toward the valley, fighting the damaged tail rotor with every movement. The hydraulic system was now almost completely failed, and she was flying the aircraft through pure muscle and determination. "Control, we're attempting an emergency landing in Grid Square, 247 to 356. Weather conditions are severe, and we're losing control authority rapidly." "Roger, Rescue 1. We have search and rescue aircraft standing by, but weather conditions are still too severe for immediate launch." Sarah almost laughed at the irony. They had successfully completed the most dangerous extraction mission in recent memory, only to face the possibility of crashing in an empty valley where no one could reach them. As they descended through the clouds, the valley floor became visible through the swirling precipitation. It was rocky and uneven, but there was a relatively flat area near the river that might be suitable for an emergency landing. "This is going to be rough," Sarah warned. "Everyone over the intercom, brace for impact." The approach was unlike anything had ever experienced. With the damaged tail rotor and failed hydraulic system, Sarah was essentially flying a barely controlled aircraft through a storm toward a landing site that was marginal at best. But her years of experience flying in challenging conditions were evident in every control input. 50 feet, Chen called out, reading the radar altimeter. 40 feet. 30 feet. The aircraft was oscillating wildly, and Sarah was using every ounce of her skill to keep them upright. The Marines in the cargo bay were holding onto anything they could find as the helicopter bucked and swayed in the turbulent air. 20 feet. 10 feet. The Black Hawk hit the ground hard, harder than any landing Sarah had ever made. The aircraft bounced once, then settled with a grinding sound as the landing gear absorbed the impact. For a moment, there was complete silence except for the sound of the storm raging outside. "Everyone okay back there?" Sarah called out. "All present and accounted for," Torres replied. "That was some flying, ma'am." Sarah shut down the engines and began securing the aircraft. They were alive, but they were also stranded in a remote valley with 2 wounded Marines and no way to communicate their exact position to rescue forces. "Shun, how's our radio equipment?" she asked. "Primary radio is functional, but our GPS system took damage during the landing. We can transmit, but we can't give them precise coordinates." Sarah looked out at the storm-lashed valley and realized that their ordeal was far from over. They had successfully rescued 8 Marines from certain death, but now all 10 of them were trapped in one of the most remote and dangerous regions of Afghanistan. "Well," she said, removing her helmet and running her hands through her hair, "I guess we wait for the weather to clear and hope that someone can find us." But even as she spoke those words, Sarah was already formulating a plan. The aircraft was damaged but not destroyed, and she had faced worse situations during her years of flying in extreme conditions. If they could survive the night and the storm passed, she might be able to get the Black Hawk airborne long enough to reach a more accessible location. Torres approached the cockpit, his expression serious. "Ma'am, I want you to know that what you did back there was the bravest thing I've ever seen. You saved 8 lives today." Sarah looked at the grizzled sergeant and felt a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "Sergeant, I may have ended my career today. I disobeyed direct orders and flew an unauthorized mission." "Ma'am, with respect, any military that would punish someone for saving lives isn't worth serving in," Torres replied. "You did what was right, regardless of the consequences." As the storm continued to rage outside, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if Torres was right. She had followed her instincts and her training, adapting to extraordinary circumstances in the way that had made her both an exceptional pilot and a constant source of concern for her superiors. The question now was whether the military would view her actions as heroic or as a dangerous violation of everything they stood for. But as she looked back at the 8 Marines who were alive because of her decision to fly into the storm, Sarah realized that she could live with whatever consequences awaited her. The longest flight of her career was over, but the most challenging part of her journey was just beginning. The storm that had provided cover for their daring rescue mission now became their greatest enemy. As night fell over the remote valley, Sarah and Chun worked frantically to assess the damage to their aircraft, while the Marines established a defensive perimeter around their improvised landing site. "The tail rotor drive shaft is cracked and we've lost most of our hydraulic fluid," Chun reported, using a flashlight to examine the aircraft's damaged systems. Even if we had parts, this isn't something we can repair in the field. Sarah nodded grimly. She had suspected as much from the way the aircraft had handled during their emergency landing. The Black Hawk was a remarkably durable machine, but the combination of enemy fire and the brutal weather conditions had pushed it beyond its limits. What about the main rotor system? She asked, climbing up to inspect the rotor head. Surprisingly, it looks intact. The engine took some small arms fire, but nothing that appears to have damaged critical components. This gave Sarah a glimmer of hope. If the main rotor system was functional and the engines were undamaged, there might be a way to get the aircraft airborne again, but it would require a level of technical improvisation that went far beyond standard maintenance procedures. Meanwhile, Staff Sergeant Torres was dealing with his own set of challenges. His team was exhausted from the firefight. 2 of his Marines were wounded, and they were stranded in enemy territory with limited ammunition and supplies. The storm provided some protection from enemy forces, but it also made it impossible for friendly forces to reach them. "Vasquez, how are Sullivan and Martinez doing?" Torres asked, crawling over to where the medic was treating the wounded Marines. "Sullivan's shoulder wound is clean, but he's lost some blood. Martinez's leg wound is more serious. There's still shrapnel in there that I can't remove without proper surgical instruments." Torres did a quick inventory of their supplies. They had enough food and water for perhaps 2 days, ammunition for maybe 1 serious firefight, and medical supplies that were already running low. If they weren't rescued soon, they would be in serious trouble. "Sergeant Torres," Sarah called, out from the aircraft. "I need to know exactly what kind of enemy presence we're dealing with in this area." Torres made his way over to the cockpit, where Sarah was studying a tactical map by flashlight. "From what we observed during the firefight, we're looking at a well-organized force with professional equipment. They had radio jamming capability, coordinated movement, and enough firepower to pin down a Marine reconnaissance team. How many fighters? Hard to say for certain, but I'd estimate at least 20, possibly more. They were using the terrain expertly, and their tactics suggested they've been operating in this area for some time." Sarah studied the map, trying to calculate distances and evaluate potential escape routes. The valley was remote and surrounded by high mountains, making it difficult for ground forces to reach them, but also limiting their options for movement. "There's a larger valley about 15 kilometers northeast of here," she said, pointing to the map. "It's got a longer, flatter area that might be suitable for a rescue helicopter to land." 15 kilometers is a long way to travel with wounded Marines and hostile forces in the area, Torres replied. "Plus, we'd be leaving the aircraft behind." "The aircraft isn't going anywhere anyway," Sarah said. "Not without major repairs that we can't perform in the field." But even as she spoke, Sarah's mind was working on a different problem. The Black Hawk's main rotor system was intact, and the engines appeared to be functional. The tail rotor was damaged beyond field repair, but there might be a way to fly the aircraft without it, if she was willing to take risks that would make her previous reckless flying look conservative by comparison. She had read about emergency procedures for flying helicopters with tail rotor failures, but they were considered extremely dangerous and were only to be attempted under the most desperate circumstances. The technique required precise control inputs and an intimate understanding of the aircraft's aerodynamics, and even then, success was far from guaranteed. "Chun, I need you to help me with something," Sarah said. "I want to see if we can get this bird airborne without the tail rotor." Chun looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Sarah, that's suicide. Flying a helicopter without a functional tail rotor is like trying to drive a car without a steering wheel." "Not exactly," Sarah replied. "It's more like trying to drive a car with a broken steering wheel. Difficult, dangerous, but not impossible if you know what you're doing." The technique involved using the aircraft's forward airspeed to provide the anti-torque force normally. supplied by the tail rotor. By maintaining a specific airspeed and angle of attack, it was theoretically possible to keep the aircraft stable enough for short-duration flight. The problem is that we can only maintain control while moving forward, Sarah explained. We can't hover, we can't make sharp turns, and we certainly can't land normally. But we might be able to fly far enough to reach a better location for rescue. Torres had been listening to the conversation with growing alarm. Ma'am, with respect, that sounds incredibly dangerous. We've already survived one impossible situation today. Maybe we shouldn't push our luck. Sarah looked at the sergeant's weathered face and saw the concern in his eyes. He was right to be worried. What she was proposing was far beyond anything she had ever attempted, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic for everyone aboard the aircraft. Sergeant, those enemy fighters know we're here, she said. Once the storm clears, they're going to come looking for us. We can try to defend this position, but we're outnumbered and low on ammunition. Our best chance is to get out of here while we still can. The wind howled through the valley, and lightning illuminated the surrounding peaks in brief, stark flashes. Sarah realized that they were facing a choice between certain death and a desperate gamble that might save all their lives. I need some time to think about this, she said. But I want everyone to be prepared for the possibility that we might be taking off again before dawn. As the Marines huddled in the cargo bay, trying to stay warm, Sarah stared out at the storm-lashed valley and wondered if her reputation for reckless flying was about to be put to the ultimate test. Dawn broke gray and sullen over the valley, with the storm finally beginning to weaken, but still producing dangerous wind conditions. Sarah had spent most of the night studying the Black Hawk's technical manuals and calculating the aerodynamic requirements for flying without a tail rotor. The mathematics were daunting. She would need to maintain a precise airspeed of approximately 60 knots while keeping the aircraft's nose pointed into the relative wind. Any deviation from these parameters would result in an uncontrollable spin that would be fatal for everyone aboard. Chun, I need your honest assessment, Sarah said as they completed their morning inspection of the aircraft. Do you think this is possible? Chun had been wrestling with the same question all night. He trusted Sarah's flying abilities more than anyone else's, but what she was proposing went beyond skill into the realm of pure desperation. The theory is sound, he said slowly. I've read about similar techniques being used in emergency situations. But Sarah, the margin for error is essentially zero. One mistake, one unexpected gust of wind, and we're all dead. And if we stay here? Chun looked around the valley, taking in their tactical situation. The storm was clearing, which meant that enemy forces would soon be able to move freely through the area. Their defensive position was weak, their ammunition was limited, and they had no way to evacuate the wounded Marines. If we stay here, we're probably dead anyway, he admitted. At least your plan gives us a chance. Staff Sergeant Torres had reached the same conclusion. His years of combat experience had taught him to evaluate risks in terms of probability of survival, and their current situation offered very poor odds. Ma'am, what do you need from us? He asked as he approached the cockpit. I need everyone to understand exactly what we're attempting, Sarah replied. This isn't going to be a normal flight. We'll be flying at a specific altitude and airspeed with very little room for maneuvering. If we encounter enemy fire, we won't be able to take evasive action. What about the wounded Marines? They'll need to be secured as well as possible. We're going to experience significant vibration and potentially violent aircraft movement. Torres nodded and turned to brief his team. Sarah watched him go, admiring his calm professionalism under pressure. She had encountered few people who could maintain their composure in such desperate circumstances. Sarah, Chun said quietly, there's something else we need to consider. Even if we can get airborne, where exactly are we going to land? We can't hover, remember? We're going to need a very specific type of landing site. Sarah had been thinking about this problem throughout the night. There's a long straight valley about 20 kilometers northeast of here. It runs roughly east-west, which means we can approach it into the wind. If we can maintain our airspeed until the last possible moment, we might be able to execute a running landing. A running landing in a helicopter with no tail rotor control? Chen's voice betrayed his skepticism. It's been done before, Sarah replied. During the Vietnam War, there were several documented cases of pilots successfully landing helicopters with tail rotor failures. The key is to maintain forward momentum until the very last second, then use the aircraft's forward energy to cushion the landing. What Sarah didn't mention was that the historical success rate for such landings was less than 50%. But given their current circumstances, 50% odds seemed remarkably optimistic. As the Marines prepared for departure, Sarah made one final check of their route and weather conditions. The storm was moving eastward, leaving behind clearing skies but still dangerous wind conditions. They would have perhaps a 2-hour window before enemy forces could effectively search for them. "Control, this is Rescue 1, Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency. "We are preparing for departure from our current position. Be advised we have sustained significant damage and will be operating under emergency flight procedures." The response was immediate and alarmed. "Rescue 1, this is Control. You are not authorized for departure. Maintain your position and wait for ground rescue forces." "Control, ground rescue forces cannot reach our position before enemy forces locate us. We are departing immediately." "Rescue 1, you are ordered to maintain position." "Repeat, maintain position." Sarah switched off the radio and looked at Chen. "Are you ready for this?" "No," Chen replied honestly. "But I'm ready to trust you." Sarah began the engine start sequence, and the familiar whine of the turbines filled the valley. The Marines in the cargo bay braced themselves as the aircraft began to vibrate with increasing intensity. "Here we go," Sarah said, pulling collective. The Black Hawk lifted off shakily, immediately beginning to yaw to the right as the main rotor torque met no resistance from the damaged tail rotor. Sarah countered with forward cyclic, building airspeed. "As quickly as possible. Airspeed 40 knots, Chen called out. 50 knots, 60 knots. At 60 knots, the aircraft suddenly stabilized. The weather vaning effect of the fuselage and the relative wind over the tail surfaces were providing just enough anti-torque force to maintain heading control. Sarah felt a surge of elation. The technique was working. "We're flying," she announced over the intercom. "Everyone hold on, we're committed now." But as they climbed out of the valley, Sarah realized that their real challenges were just beginning. They were flying a barely controllable aircraft through dangerous weather conditions toward an uncertain landing site, with enemy forces potentially tracking their movement. The next 20 minutes would determine whether her reputation for reckless flying was justified, or whether it would save the lives of everyone aboard the aircraft. The Black Hawk carved through the turbulent air like a wounded bird, its damaged tail rotor creating a constant reminder of how precarious their situation had become. Sarah maintained the critical 60-knot airspeed with religious precision, knowing that even a 5-knot deviation could send them into an unrecoverable spin. "How are we doing back there?" she called over the intercom. "Everyone's secure," Torres replied, though his voice betrayed the stress of their situation. "Martinez is having a rough time with his leg wound, but Vasquez is keeping him stable." The valley Sarah had identified as their destination was still 15 kilometers away, but the aircraft was handling better than she had dared hope. The weather vaning effect was providing just enough stability to maintain control, though she had to constantly fight the aircraft's tendency to yaw right. "Chen, I need you to monitor our fuel consumption," Sarah said. "We're burning more fuel than normal because of the increased drag from flying with the nose slightly into the wind." Current consumption rate gives us about 45 minutes of flight time, Chen replied after checking his instruments. That should be enough to reach the valley with a reasonable reserve. But as they flew deeper into the mountains, new challenges emerged. The terrain was forcing them to fly higher than Sarah had planned, and the thinner air at altitude was affecting the aircraft's performance. She had to constantly adjust her control inputs to maintain the precise flight parameters required. For stability, "Sarah, we've got company," Chen said, pointing toward a ridge to their left. Through the clearing weather, they could see vehicles moving along a mountain road. The distance was too great to determine if they were friendly or enemy forces, but Sarah couldn't take any chances. "Are they tracking us?" she asked. "Hard to tell, but they seem to be moving in the same general direction we are." Sarah realized that their flight path was taking them over terrain that could be easily observed from multiple vantage points. If enemy forces were monitoring their movement, they might be able to predict their destination and set up an ambush. "We need to change course," she decided. "There's a secondary valley about 10 kilometers south of our original destination. It's not as ideal for landing, but it might throw off anyone who's tracking us." Changing course in a helicopter with no tail rotor control was like trying to turn a speeding car with broken power steering. Sarah had to bank the aircraft carefully while maintaining her critical airspeed, using the aircraft's natural tendency to weather vane to help execute the turn. Turning left to heading 180, she announced. The maneuver was successful, but it cost them precious fuel and time. More importantly, it took them toward terrain that was less favorable for their planned running landing. "Sarah, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this new valley is shorter and has more obstacles," Chen said, studying their tactical map. "We're going to have maybe half the landing distance we had planned for. Then we'll have to make it work," Sarah replied. "We don't have any other options." As they approached the new valley, Sarah could see that Chen's assessment was accurate. The valley was narrower and shorter than she had hoped, with rocky outcroppings and scattered trees that would make a running landing extremely challenging. "Control, this is Rescue 1, she transmitted. "We are approaching an emergency landing. Sighted grid 278 to 445. We have sustained significant damage and will be attempting an emergency landing procedure. Rescue 1, we have search and rescue aircraft standing by. Can you maintain position until they arrive? Negative control. We are committed to landing immediately. Fuel state is critical, and aircraft damage prevents extended flight operations." What Sarah didn't mention was that her arms were beginning to ache from the constant control inputs required to maintain stability. Flying a helicopter without tail rotor control was physically exhausting, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could maintain the precise control required. "Chen, I need you to take over some of the radio work," she said. "I need to concentrate entirely on flying." "Roger, what do you need me to tell them?" "Tell them we're going to attempt a running landing in approximately 5 minutes. If we're successful, we'll need immediate medical evacuation for 2 wounded Marines. If we're not successful, double quotes." Chen understood. "I'll handle the radio traffic." As they entered the valley, Sarah began her approach. The technique required her to maintain 60 knots until the very last moment, then use the aircraft's forward momentum to cushion the landing. There would be no opportunity for a go-around if something went wrong. 1 mile from touchdown," Chen announced. "Half mile, quarter mile." Sarah could see the intended landing site now, a relatively flat area near a dried riverbed. It was rough and rocky, but it was the best option available. 100 feet above ground, 50 feet, 20 feet. Sarah began to reduce power while maintaining forward airspeed. The aircraft was descending rapidly, and she had to time her. Flare perfectly to avoid either striking the ground too hard or losing control entirely. "Here we go," she said, Pulling back on the cyclic to arrest their descent, the Black Hawk hit the ground hard, bounced once, and then settled with a grinding crash as the landing gear absorbed the impact. For a moment, there was silence except for the sound of the engines winding down. Then Torres's voice came over the intercom. "Outstanding flying, ma'am. We're all alive and on the ground." Sarah slumped back in her seat, exhausted from the most challenging flight of her career. They had successfully completed what military aviation experts would later describe as one of the most difficult emergency landings ever attempted. But their ordeal was far from over. They were still in enemy territory, still had wounded Marines who needed medical attention, and still faced the possibility of capture or death. The rescue helicopter arrived 3 hours later, its crew amazed to find all 10 personnel alive and relatively unharmed. As Sarah watched the wounded Marines being loaded onto stretchers, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had successfully completed their mission, but she knew that her unauthorized flight would have serious consequences. "Captain Mitchell," the rescue pilot called out as he approached her position. "I'm Captain Rodriguez. I was supposed to fly the original extraction mission." Sarah recognized the name. Rodriguez was known for his adherence to safety protocols and standard operating procedures. He represented everything that her superiors valued in military aviation. "Captain Rodriguez," she replied, unsure of what to expect. "Ma'am, I want you to know that what you did today was the most impressive flying I've ever witnessed. I've been flying for 12 years, and I would never have attempted what you accomplished." Sarah was surprised by his respectful tone. She had expected criticism or condemnation from her fellow pilots. "I disobeyed direct orders," she said. "I flew an unauthorized mission in weather conditions that grounded everyone else." "Yes, ma'am, you did," Rodriguez replied. "And because of that, 8 Marines are going home to their families instead of being shipped home in flag-draped coffins." The flight back to base was subdued. Sarah knew that Major Thompson would be waiting for her, and she expected the worst. Her military career was almost certainly over, and she might face criminal charges for her actions. As they landed at the base, Sarah could see a crowd of personnel gathered around the landing pad. Word of their dramatic rescue and emergency landing had spread throughout the base, and everyone wanted to see the pilot who had accomplished the impossible. Major Thompson was indeed waiting for her, his expression unreadable as she approached. Sarah came to attention and prepared for the worst. "Captain Mitchell," he said formally, "you are hereby relieved of all flight duties, pending a full investigation into your actions." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "You deliberately disobeyed direct orders, violated numerous safety regulations, and endangered the lives of your crew and passengers." "Yes, sir, I did." Thompson paused, studying her face. "You also saved the lives of 8 Marines who would have died if you had followed standard procedures." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond to that statement. "The investigation will determine the appropriate consequences for your actions," Thompson continued. "But I want you to know that personally, I've never been prouder to serve with another officer." The investigation took 3 weeks. Sarah was confined to base during that time, uncertain about her future and trying to come to terms with the events that had changed her life forever. She received hundreds of letters from fellow service members, family members of the rescued Marines, and aviation enthusiasts around the world. Staff Sergeant Torres and his team provided detailed testimony about the rescue mission, emphasizing that Sarah's flying had been the difference between life and death for all of them. Lieutenant Chen corroborated her account of the technical challenges they had faced and the extraordinary skill required to overcome them. The final hearing was held in a packed auditorium, with media representatives and military officials from around the world in attendance. Sarah sat at the defendant's table, wearing her dress uniform and trying to maintain her composure. "Captain Mitchell," the presiding officer began, You are charged with disobeying direct orders, violating flight safety regulations, and endangering the lives of military personnel. How do you plead?" "Guilty, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. The admission surprised many observers, who had expected her to mount a defense based on the extraordinary circumstances of the rescue mission. "You understand that these charges could result in a dishonorable discharge and possible imprisonment." "Yes, sir, I understand." The hearing proceeded with testimony from various witnesses, including the Marines who had been rescued, the base commanders who had grounded her, and aviation experts who analyzed her flying techniques. The picture that emerged was of a pilot whose unconventional methods had saved lives but had also violated fundamental military principles. After 3 days of testimony, the panel reached its decision. Sarah stood as the presiding officer read the verdict. "Captain Mitchell, this panel finds you guilty of all charges. However, we also find that your actions were motivated by the highest ideals of military service, the protection of fellow service members, and the successful completion of the mission." Sarah held her breath, waiting for the sentence. "You are hereby sentenced to a formal reprimand and reduction in rank to first lieutenant. However, in recognition of your extraordinary heroism and flying skill, you are also awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and reassigned to the Military Test Pilot School." The auditorium erupted in applause as Sarah struggled to understand what had just happened. She had been punished for her actions, but she had also been recognized for her heroism and given an opportunity to continue her aviation career. Later, as she stood outside the hearing room, Staff Sergeant Torres approached her. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. My Marines and I owe you our lives." "Sergeant, I just did what any pilot would have done in the same situation," Torres smiled. "No, ma'am, you did what Sarah Mitchell would have done. And that made all the difference." As Sarah walked across the base toward her new assignment, she reflected on the events that had changed her life. She had been grounded for being too reckless, but her recklessness had saved 8 lives. She had violated military regulations, but she had upheld the highest traditions of military service. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in her career, Sarah Mitchell felt that she was exactly where she belonged, flying on the edge of possibility, where courage and skill could make the difference between life and death. 6 months after the rescue mission that had made her both a hero and a cautionary tale, First Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell found herself standing on the Vandal tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base, home to the most prestigious test pilot school in the world. The California desert stretched endlessly in all directions, its harsh beauty a stark contrast to the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan, where her life had changed forever. "Mitchell, you're late," called out Colonel Patricia Hayes, the school's deputy commander, as Sarah approached the briefing room. "Test pilots are never late. They're either early or they're investigating why their aircraft didn't perform as expected." Sarah quickened her pace, still adjusting to the culture of test pilot school. Here, breaking rules wasn't just tolerated. It was expected, as long as those rule-breaking activities advanced the science of flight and improved aircraft safety. It was exactly the kind of environment where her unconventional approach to aviation might finally be appreciated rather than criticized. The briefing room was filled with some of the most accomplished pilots in military aviation. Fighter pilots with thousands of combat hours, helicopter pilots who had pushed the boundaries of rotorcraft performance, and experimental aircraft specialists who routinely flew machines that existed nowhere else on Earth. Sarah felt both intimidated and exhilarated to be among such company. Today, we're going to discuss emergency flight procedures and the psychology of risk assessment, Colonel Hayes announced as the pilots settled into their seats. Our case study is a recent incident involving an unauthorized rescue mission conducted in extreme weather conditions using damaged aircraft. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that her own mission was going to be dissected and analyzed by her new classmates. She had hoped to start fresh at test pilot school, but apparently, her reputation had preceded her. The pilot in question violated numerous regulations and safety protocols. Hayes continued, but successfully rescued 8 Marines who would have otherwise died. The question we need to examine is whether this pilot's actions represent exceptional airmanship or dangerous disregard for established procedures. For the next 2 hours, Sarah sat in uncomfortable silence as her fellow pilots debated every aspect of her rescue mission. Some praised her adaptability and skill, while others criticized her decision to ignore orders and fly in dangerous conditions. The problem with this type of heroic flying is that it sets a dangerous precedent, argued Major Susan Chen, a veteran fighter pilot. If we start praising pilots for breaking rules, where does it end? Military aviation depends on discipline and adherence to established procedures. But military aviation also depends on completing the mission and bringing everyone home, countered Captain Mike Rodriguez, who Sarah was surprised to see among her classmates. Sometimes extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses. Sarah recognized the names and voices but tried to remain inconspicuous as the debate continued. She was grateful when Colonel Hayes finally called for a break. "Mitchell, a word with you," Hayes said as the other pilots filed out of the room. Sarah approached the colonel's desk, unsure of what to expect. Hayes was known for her direct communication style and her intolerance for anything less than perfection. "That was your mission they were discussing," Hayes said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, ma'am." "How did it feel to listen to your colleagues debate whether you're a hero or a hazard?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Honestly, ma'am, I've been asking myself the same question for 6 months. I saved 8 lives, but I also violated every principle of military aviation that I was taught to respect." Hayes nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of self-awareness we need in test pilots. The ability to push boundaries while understanding the consequences of those actions." "Ma'am, if I may ask, why was my mission chosen as a case study?" "Because it perfectly illustrates the central challenge of experimental aviation," Hayes replied. "Test pilots are expected to fly aircraft and execute procedures that have never been tried before. We're constantly operating in the gray area between calculated risk and reckless endangerment." Sarah began to understand why she had been assigned to test pilot school despite her disciplinary problems. Her willingness to adapt and improvise, the very qualities that had gotten her into trouble in conventional military aviation, were exactly what experimental aviation required. "Your next assignment is to develop emergency procedures for helicopter operations with tail rotor failures," Hayes continued. "Since you're apparently the only pilot in military aviation who has successfully flown a helicopter without a functional tail rotor, you're uniquely qualified for this project." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into the technical challenges of test pilot school. She worked with engineers and aerodynamic specialists to analyze the flight characteristics of damaged aircraft, developing new procedures that could save lives in emergency situations. Her first test flight was in a specially modified helicopter that had been equipped with systems to simulate tail rotor failure. As she lifted off from the Edwards Air Force Base runway, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of an aircraft that wanted to spin out of control. "Test conditions are set," announced her flight test engineer over the radio. "Simulated tail rotor failure in 3, 2, 1 mark." Immediately, the helicopter began to yaw violently to the right, but this time, Sarah was prepared. She had spent weeks studying the aerodynamics of helicopter flight without tail rotor authority, and she smoothly transitioned into the emergency flight regime she had discovered during her desperate flight in Afghanistan. "Stable flight achieved," she reported. "Airspeed 62 knots, maintaining heading control through weather vaning effect." For the next 30 minutes, Sarah put the helicopter through a series of test maneuvers. pushing the boundaries of what was possible with a tail rotor failure. She executed turns, altitude changes, and approach procedures that had never been attempted under controlled conditions. "Outstanding work, Mitchell," came the voice of Colonel Hayes from the control room. "You've just validated emergency procedures that could save hundreds of lives in the future." As Sarah landed the test helicopter and shut down the engines, she realized that she had found her calling. Test pilot school wasn't just about flying experimental aircraft. It was about expanding the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. Using controlled, risk-taking to advance the science of flight, the young woman who had been grounded for reckless flying had become a test pilot, whose recklessness was now serving to make aviation safer for everyone. It was a transformation that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, but Sarah was learning that in the world of experimental aviation, impossible was just another engineering challenge to be solved. Her unconventional approach to flying, once seen as a liability, had become her greatest asset. She was no longer the pilot who broke rules. She was the pilot who rewrote them. 2 years after the rescue mission that had changed Sarah's career trajectory, she received an unexpected invitation to speak at the Marine Corps Basic School in Quantico, Virginia. The invitation came from Staff Sergeant Torres, who had been promoted and was now serving as an instructor for new Marine officers. "Ma'am, we're teaching a course on leadership in extreme situations," Torres explained over the phone. "Your rescue mission has become a case study in tactical decision-making under pressure. We'd like you to share your perspective with our new officers." Sarah accepted the invitation, curious to learn how her actions were being interpreted and taught to the next generation of military leaders. She flew to Virginia in a T-38 trainer, one of the perks of being a test pilot that she never took for granted. The auditorium at Quantico was packed with young Marine officers, their faces reflecting the same mixture of confidence and uncertainty that Sarah remembered from her own early military career. As she took the podium, she noticed several familiar faces in the audience: Lance Corporal Vasquez, now a sergeant, and Private First Class Sullivan, who had recovered completely from his shoulder wound and been promoted to corporal. 2 years ago, I was grounded for what my commanding officers called reckless flying, Sarah began. 3 days later, that same reckless flying saved the lives of 8 Marines. Today, I want to talk to you about the difference between recklessness and adaptive leadership. She spent the next hour walking the young officers through the decisions she had made during the rescue mission, emphasizing not the heroic aspects of the story, but the analytical process that had guided her actions. "Every decision I made that day involved calculated risk," she explained. "I didn't fly into that storm because I was brave or reckless. I flew into it because I had the specific skills and experience needed to operate in those conditions, and because 8 lives depended on someone being willing to accept that risk." During the question and answer session, a young second lieutenant raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you know when breaking rules is justified?" Sarah had been expecting this question, and she had given it considerable thought. The key is understanding the difference between rules that exist for administrative convenience and rules that exist for safety. Administrative rules can sometimes be bent when extraordinary circumstances require it. Safety rules should never be ignored. They should be adapted. Can you give us an example? When I flew that unauthorized mission, I broke administrative rules about flight authorization and chain of command approval. But I didn't break safety rules. I adapted them to fit extraordinary circumstances. I used my understanding of aerodynamics and weather to operate safely in conditions that would have been dangerous for pilots without my specific background. After the formal presentation, Sarah was approached by Sergeant Torres, who wanted to introduce her to some of the Marines who had been rescued during the mission. "Ma'am, I don't know if you remember me," said Sergeant Vasquez, now clean-shaven and wearing dress blues instead of combat gear. "I was the team medic." "Of course I remember you, Sergeant. How are Sullivan and Martinez doing? Both fully recovered and back on active duty. Sullivan's actually here at Quantico now, going through officer candidate school. Martinez is deployed again, but he asked me to thank you if I ever saw you. As they talked, Sarah learned how the rescue mission had affected each of the Marines who had been saved that day. Sullivan had decided to become an officer partly because of the leadership he had witnessed during the crisis. Vasquez had been inspired to pursue advanced medical training. Several others had written letters to their families describing how the experience had changed their perspective on duty and sacrifice. "Ma'am, there's something else," Torres said. "The Marine Corps has officially adopted your emergency helicopter procedures as part of our standard training curriculum. Every Marine pilot now learns the techniques you developed for flying with tail rotor failures." Sarah was stunned. She had known that her work at test pilot school was being incorporated into training programs, but she hadn't realized the extent to which her emergency procedures had been adopted across the military. "It's not just the Marines," Vasquez added. "The Army, Navy, and Air Force have all integrated your procedures into their pilot training programs. You've probably saved hundreds of lives that you'll never know about." This revelation put Sarah's career transformation into a new perspective. Her rescue of 8 Marines had been dramatic and highly publicized, but her work as a test pilot was having a much broader impact on aviation safety. The procedures she was developing and testing were being used by pilots around the world, potentially preventing accidents and saving lives on a scale she had never imagined. Later that evening, as Sarah prepared to fly back to Edwards Air Force Base, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that stormy night in Afghanistan. She had gone from being a pilot whose career was nearly ended by her unconventional flying style to being someone whose unconventional approaches were being studied and adopted throughout military aviation. The young Marines she had rescued were now sergeants and corporals, leading their own teams and applying the lessons they had learned during their crisis. The emergency procedures she had improvised under desperate circumstances were now part of standard pilot training. Her reputation for reckless flying had evolved into recognition as an innovative test pilot who was expanding the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. As she climbed into the T-38 for the flight home, Sarah realized that her story wasn't really about one dramatic rescue mission. It was about the importance of adaptive thinking, calculated risk-taking, and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom when lives were at stake. The pilot who had been grounded for breaking rules had become the pilot who was rewriting them, and in doing so, she was making aviation safer for everyone who would follow in her wake. 5 years after the rescue mission that had transformed her from a disciplinary problem into a test pilot legend, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood in the hangar at Edwards Air Force Base, looking at the most advanced helicopter ever built. The aircraft before her represented the culmination of years of research and development, incorporating safety features and emergency procedures that had been directly influenced by her work. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the chief engineer for the project. "Every major system has multiple redundancies, and the flight control software includes algorithms based on your emergency flying techniques." Sarah walked around the aircraft, admiring the sleek lines and advanced technology. The new helicopter featured a revolutionary fly-by-wire system that could automatically compensate for tail rotor failures, using the same aerodynamic principles she had discovered during her desperate flight in Afghanistan. "How many test flights are planned?" Sarah asked. 53 initial test flights, followed by operational evaluation with select military units, Walsh replied. "You'll be the primary test pilot for the emergency systems evaluation." Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of excitement and responsibility that came with testing new aircraft. Each test flight was an opportunity to advance aviation technology, but it also carried Risks that required careful calculation and preparation. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Staff Sergeant Torres. Now Master Sergeant Torres, and serving as a senior instructor at the Marine Corps Staff College. The message was brief but meaningful. Watching the news coverage of your new bird. The Marines you saved are now training the next generation. The ripple effect continues. Sarah smiled as she read the message. Over the years, she had stayed in contact with most of the Marines from the rescue mission. They had all advanced in their careers, and several had become leaders in their respective fields. Their experiences during the crisis had shaped their approach to leadership and decision-making, creating a positive influence that extended far beyond the original rescue. Colonel Mitchell called out her current co-pilot, Major David Park, as he approached with a thick folder of test procedures. The pre-flight briefing is ready. We're cleared for our first evaluation flight at 1400 hours. Sarah took the folder and began reviewing the test plan. The flight would evaluate the aircraft's performance under simulated emergency conditions, including the tail rotor failure scenarios that had become her specialty. It was exactly the kind of mission that combined technical innovation with practical safety improvements. As she studied the procedures, Sarah reflected on how her perspective on flying had evolved over the years. The young pilot who had once been criticized for taking unnecessary risks had become someone who understood that real aviation safety came not from avoiding all risks, but from understanding and managing them effectively. Major Park, I want to make sure you understand something about today's test flight, she said. We're going to be pushing this aircraft to its limits, but we're doing it in a controlled environment with extensive safety precautions. The goal isn't to take risks. It's to expand the safety envelope for future pilots. Park nodded, understanding the distinction. He had specifically requested assignment as Sarah's co-pilot because he wanted to learn from someone who had successfully combined innovation with safety. The test flight proceeded flawlessly. The new helicopter performed exactly as the engineers had predicted, and the emergency flight control systems worked seamlessly during simulated failures. Sarah executed a series of maneuvers that would have been impossible in older aircraft, demonstrating how technology could enhance rather than replace pilot skill. Outstanding performance, came the voice of the flight test director over the radio. All test objectives have been met. You're cleared to return to base. As Sarah landed the prototype helicopter, she was approached by a group of young pilots who were observing the test program. They represented the next generation of military aviators, and their questions reflected both respect for her achievements and curiosity about her unconventional path to success. Ma'am, what advice would you give to pilots who want to make a difference in aviation? Asked one of the young lieutenants. Sarah considered the question carefully. Focus on understanding why procedures exist, not just memorizing them. The best pilots are the ones who can adapt established procedures to meet extraordinary circumstances while maintaining safety as their primary concern. Is it true that you were almost court-martialed for the rescue mission? Asked another pilot. I was court-martialed, Sarah replied. But the military justice system recognized that extraordinary circumstances sometimes require extraordinary responses. The key is making sure that your extraordinary responses are based on skill and judgment, not recklessness or ego. As the young pilots dispersed, Sarah walked back toward the hangar, thinking about the legacy of that stormy night in Afghanistan. 8 Marines had been saved, but the impact had extended far beyond that single rescue. The emergency procedures she had developed were now standard training for military pilots worldwide. The test aircraft she was evaluating would incorporate safety features that could prevent future tragedies. The young pilots she was mentoring would carry forward the lessons of adaptive leadership and calculated risk-taking. That evening, as Sarah reviewed the day's test data in her office, she received an email that made her pause. It was from Martinez. the Marine who had been wounded during the original firefight and was now a sergeant major serving in a training role. "Ma'am," the email read, "I wanted you to know that I'm retiring next month after 20 years of service. During my retirement ceremony, I'm going to tell the story of how a reckless pilot taught me the difference between taking foolish risks and making courageous decisions. Thank you for showing us what leadership looks like when everything is on the line." Sarah leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the realization of how one decision made during a crisis had rippled outward to affect so many lives. She had saved 8 Marines during a storm, but those Marines had gone on to save others, train future leaders, and contribute to their communities in ways that multiplied the impact of that original rescue. The pilot who had once been grounded for reckless flying had become someone whose influence extended far beyond aviation. She had learned that true leadership wasn't about following rules perfectly. It was about knowing when and how to adapt those rules to serve a higher purpose. As she turned off the lights in her office and headed home, Sarah Mitchell knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new aircraft to test, and new opportunities to push the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. It was exactly where she belonged, at the intersection of innovation and safety, where courage and skill could continue to make a difference in the lives of others. The rescue mission was over, but the mission to make aviation safer and more effective would continue for as long as she could fly. And that, Sarah realized, was the greatest legacy she could leave, not just the lives she had saved on one stormy night, but the lives that would be saved by the procedures, technologies, and leadership principles that had grown out of that experience. The story that had begun with a grounded pilot and 8 trapped Marines had become something much larger, a testament to the power of adaptive thinking, calculated courage, and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom in service of a greater good. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.